A teacher was accused of a murder she did not commit and sentenced to death. Her world fell apart while the real killer was enjoying his freedom. The truth about the case was buried and the time of his execution was approaching. What now? Will justice convict an innocent person? Sarah, a dedicated teacher in her late 20s, spent her days inspiring young minds in her quiet suburban town. Known for her compassion, she often went above and beyond to help struggling students, like Jake, a teen from a troubled background whom she tutored for free. But her peaceful life was shattered when police arrived at her doorstep, accusing her of a brutal crime she had no part in. The murder of a prominent politician shook the community, and Sarah, with her connection to Jake, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight as the prime suspect. Despite her pleas of innocence, the evidence against her seemed overwhelming, and the justice system showed no mercy. It was an ordinary evening when Sarah heard the knock at her door. Dressed in her casual sweater and jeans, she greeted the officers with a polite smile, one that quickly faded when they presented the warrant for her arrest. Confusion clouded her face as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the metal cold and unyielding. Neighbors peeked from their windows as Sarah was escorted to the patrol car. Whispers spread like wildfire, their curious stares piercing her with silent judgment. She could only manage fragmented protests. "This must be a mistake. I didn't do anything." But her words were drowned out by the sirens blaring into the night. Inside the police station, Sarah sat under the stark fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, her palms clammy against the steel table. Questions about her connection to Jake and the victim came rapid fire, each one building a case she couldn't comprehend. Her mind raced, replaying every innocent interaction with Jake, desperately searching for answers. The officers laid out the so-called evidence: a late-night text to Jake, her proximity to the crime scene, and circumstantial ties to the victim. With every word, Sarah's heart sank deeper. This can't be happening, she thought, her voice trembling as she denied any involvement. By the time the charges were filed, the gravity of her situation hit her like a tidal wave. Her once simple life had been ripped away, replaced by the grim reality of a criminal accusation. Sitting in the holding cell, Sarah's tears fell silently, her only comfort the faint hope that someone, anyone, would believe her. As the prosecution began constructing their case, Sarah's world grew even darker. News outlets plastered her face across screens, branding her as the killer teacher. Headlines screamed accusations, fueling public outrage. The evidence presented painted her as a manipulative figure who used her position to orchestrate the crime, a narrative as shocking as it was false. Prosecutors highlighted her relationship with Jake, twisting her innocent tutoring sessions into something sinister. She gained his trust to get closer to the victim, they alleged in court, their voices dripping with conviction. Sarah sat silently, her wide eyes staring at the floor, unable to comprehend how her kindness had become her undoing. Meanwhile, her community, once supportive, grew divided. Friends she had known for years distanced themselves, afraid of the stigma. Even her school suspended her, citing the severity of the charges. Sarah's isolation deepened, leaving her clinging to the few who still believed in her innocence, like her lawyer, Lucas, and a handful of students who refused to accept the media's portrayal. As Lucas prepared her defense, he found himself cornered. The circumstantial evidence seemed airtight: Sarah's presence near the crime scene, Jake's connection to her, and her text messages exchanged the night before the murder. Yet something felt off to him. "We're missing something," Lucas murmured to himself, poring over the case files late into the night. Sarah, meanwhile, fought to hold on to hope. Alone in her prison cell, she replayed her last encounters with Jake and the victim, searching for any detail that could help her case. But the weight of the accusations and the looming death penalty pressed heavily on her, pushing her to the brink of despair. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Sarah's trial, with every seat filled by journalists, community members, and those seeking drama. Sarah, dressed in a modest black blazer, sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her pale face betrayed the anxiety brewing within her as she glanced at Lucas, who shuffled through a stack of notes. The prosecution wasted no time painting Sarah as a cunning manipulator. She used her role as a teacher to get close to the victim through Jake, the lead prosecutor declared, pointing toward her. They presented the timeline of events, emphasizing Sarah's presence near the crime scene and her suspicious late-night messages. Each word felt like a nail in the coffin, and Sarah's heart sank further with every accusation. Lucas countered with a passionate defense, arguing that Sarah's actions had been entirely innocent and altruistic. Helping a troubled student doesn't make her a killer, he stated firmly, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. He pointed out inconsistencies in the evidence and gaps in the investigation, but his efforts seemed drowned out by the prosecution's relentless attacks. When Sarah took the stand, her voice wavered as she recounted her version of events. She described her dedication to Jake, her shock at the accusations, and her absolute innocence. Tears welled in her eyes as she said, "I would never hurt anyone. I don't even know how this happened to me." The room fell silent, but the judge's stern expression offered no reassurance. As the trial drew to a close, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The jury delivered their verdict with heavy finality. Guilty. Sarah's legs buckled as the sentence was announced. Death by lethal injection. The sound of the gavel echoed in her ears, sealing her fate. Lucas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, whispering, "This isn't over." But for Sarah, it felt like the end of everything. The sterile, gray walls of Sarah's cell became her new reality. Every sound echoed sharply, the metallic clang of doors, the distant footsteps of guards, and the hum of fluorescent lights. She sat on the narrow cot, staring at the small barred window, her mind consumed by the crushing weight of her sentence. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah began to lose track of time. The isolation was suffocating, but it was the gnawing sense of injustice that haunted her most. How did it come to this? She whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Despite her attempts to remain strong, tears often spilled onto the diary she began keeping, a desperate attempt to make sense of the chaos. Among the inmates, Sarah found fragments of humanity. One woman, a fellow prisoner, would quietly slide books under her cell door, small acts of kindness that reminded Sarah she wasn't completely alone. At night, she would read by the dim light, losing herself in the pages to escape her despair, even if only briefly. Meanwhile, Lucas visited frequently, his determined face a stark contrast to Sarah's growing exhaustion. He assured her that he was still working on her case, combing through every piece of evidence for a breakthrough. "I won't let them take you," he promised, his voice firm. Yet Sarah couldn't help but feel the creeping fear that time was slipping away. Despite everything, Sarah refused to let the system break her entirely. She began teaching the inmates, offering lessons in reading and writing, and even lending a sympathetic ear when they needed someone to talk to. In these small moments, Sarah rediscovered a sliver of her purpose, a reason to fight, not just for herself, but for the hope that justice could still prevail. Lucas sat hunched over his desk, the glow of his desk lamp highlighting the deep furrows in his brow. Piles of case files, court transcripts, and hastily scribbled notes surrounded him, a testament to his relentless drive. "There has to be something here," he muttered, flipping through pages late into the night. The image of Sarah's despair haunted him, fueling his resolve. Determined to overturn her conviction, Lucas began revisiting every detail of the investigation. He reached out to witnesses, combed through overlooked evidence, and pressed local authorities for access to unreleased files. Each roadblock he faced only hardened his determination, especially as he uncovered inconsistencies in the timeline presented at trial. During a late-night call with an informant, Lucas learned of an unexamined security camera near the crime scene, a potential key to Sarah's innocence. His heart raced as he pressed for more information, sensing a breakthrough. "Why wasn't this footage submitted?" he demanded, frustration lacing his voice. The informant's hesitant response hinted at negligence or worse, deliberate suppression. With renewed vigor, Lucas tracked down the footage, spending hours navigating bureaucratic red tape. When he finally obtained it, he held his breath as the video played. There, in grainy black and white, was a shadowy figure entering the scene. a person entirely unaccounted for in the prosecution's case. Lucas's hands shook as relief and urgency collided. "This changes everything," he whispered, staring at the screen. But Lucas knew the battle was far from over. Convincing the courts to accept this evidence and stay Sarah's execution would be a monumental task. With the clock ticking, he gathered his findings and prepared for the legal fight of his life. Lucas sat in the dimly lit courtroom, gripping the USB drive containing the newly discovered security footage. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and determination as he reviewed his plan. "This is it," he thought, his mind racing with possibilities. If the court rejected this evidence, Sarah's fate would be sealed. The video clearly showed a shadowy figure entering the crime scene moments before the murder. Though grainy, the person's build and movements did not match Sarah's at all. Lucas replayed it again and again, searching for details that would solidify its credibility. Each time he watched, his certainty grew. This was the missing link. Presenting the evidence to the court was no easy feat. The prosecution immediately challenged its validity, arguing it was too late to introduce new material. The judge, stern and skeptical, leaned forward. Why wasn't this evidence included during the trial? Lucas stood firm, his voice steady as he explained the negligence in the original investigation. The courtroom grew tense as the video played on the projector for all to see. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the figure in the footage became clear, a revelation that contradicted the prosecution's narrative. Sarah, seated in the defendant's chair, dared to hope for the first time in weeks. Despite the powerful impact of the footage, Lucas knew this was only the beginning. He had to convince the judge not only of Sarah's innocence but also of the system's failure. "This is more than a mistake," he declared, his voice filled with conviction. "This is the truth they tried to bury." The morning of Sarah's execution dawned with an eerie stillness. She sat in her small cell, her hands trembling as she stared at the gray walls that had confined her for months. Outside, the faint hum of protesters chanting her name could be heard, their cries for justice mingling with the oppressive silence of the prison corridors. Guards arrived at her door, their faces neutral but their eyes betraying discomfort. "It's time," one of them said quietly, unlocking the heavy door. Sarah stood, her legs weak beneath her, and took slow, deliberate steps. Dressed in a plain white jumpsuit, she clutched a small, dog-eared Bible, a gift from a fellow inmate, close to her chest. Meanwhile, Lucas raced against time, the video evidence in hand, his heart pounding as he navigated the crowded streets leading to the courthouse. He had fought tirelessly to secure an emergency hearing, but with minutes to spare, any delay could mean Sarah's life. "Just hold on," he whispered, gripping the USB tightly, his determination unwavering. Inside the execution chamber, Sarah was strapped to the gurney, her breathing shallow but steady. She closed her eyes, willing herself to remain calm despite the overwhelming fear coursing through her veins. The witnesses seated behind the glass were divided. Some murmured support, while others exchanged judgmental glances. As the executioner reached for the lever, a guard burst into the chamber, his voice urgent. "Stop! There's been a court order to halt the execution." Relief and disbelief washed over Sarah's face as the straps were loosened, and she was helped to her feet. Outside, the protests erupted into cheers, while Lucas stood in the courthouse, exhausted but triumphant. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Lucas stepped forward, gripping the USB drive containing the security footage. Sarah sat beside him, her face pale but her eyes flickering with a glimmer of hope. Across the aisle, the prosecution stood firm, their confidence unshaken, prepared to discredit the last-minute evidence. As the video played on the large screen, the room fell silent. The grainy footage revealed the shadowy figure entering the crime scene, a stark contradiction to the prosecution's timeline. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, and the judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lucas paused the video, his voice steady but charged with emotion. This evidence proves Sarah was nowhere near the scene at the time of the crime. The prosecutor sprang into action, questioning the timing and authenticity of the footage. "This is an act of desperation," they argued, their tone sharp. But Lucas countered with a firm rebuttal, presenting timestamps, expert analysis, and the glaring gaps in the original investigation. Each point dismantled the case against Sarah, piece by piece. The judge, visibly conflicted, called for a brief recess to deliberate. Sarah sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly as Lucas leaned in. "We've done everything we can," he whispered, his voice calm but encouraging. "Now it's up to the judge." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. When the court reconvened, the judge's voice echoed through the silent room. "After reviewing the evidence, it is clear that significant errors occurred in this investigation. The conviction of Sarah Johnson is hereby vacated." Gasps and applause erupted from the gallery as Sarah's shackles were removed. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to Lucas, who simply smiled and said, "You're free." The prison gates creaked open, and Sarah stepped out into the blinding sunlight, her hands trembling as they shielded her eyes. A small crowd of supporters and reporters waited outside, their cheers and camera flashes overwhelming her senses. Dressed in the same plain jumpsuit she wore in the cell, she looked fragile, yet her eyes reflected a quiet resilience. Lucas was the first to greet her, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Welcome back," he said softly, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions around them. Sarah hesitated before gripping his hand, her gratitude spilling into a whispered, "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." The crowd pressed in as reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. "How does it feel to be free? What's your message to the justice system?" Lucas raised a protective arm, guiding Sarah to a waiting car. "No statements today," he said firmly, shielding her from the relentless onslaught. Inside the car, Sarah finally exhaled, her body sinking into the seat as tears rolled down her cheeks. She gazed out the window at the city that had once been her home but now felt foreign. "I'm free," she murmured, as if trying to convince herself of the reality. Lucas nodded beside her, his expression a mix of relief and determination. As the car pulled away, Sarah's mind churned with conflicting emotions: relief, anger, and a newfound sense of purpose. She wasn't just leaving behind the prison walls. She was stepping into a world that had branded her guilty. Her freedom was only the beginning of her fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all those the system had failed. Freedom came at a cost. For Sarah, the world beyond the prison walls was both a relief and a challenge. The media's spotlight remained relentless, following her every move. Headlines swung between celebrating her release and questioning the justice system, leaving her reputation in a fragile balance. "Can you ever truly be free after this?" Sarah asked Lucas during one of their many discussions. Returning to her apartment, Sarah found the silence deafening. Her once welcoming home now felt like a stranger's space, with unopened mail piling up and her belongings layered in dust. The weight of the months lost bore down on her as she unpacked her emotions, her diary from prison now her only solace. Despite the odds, Sarah refused to be a victim of her circumstances. She began meeting with advocacy groups, sharing her story to expose the cracks in the system that nearly destroyed her life. Her voice, once trembling with fear, grew strong with conviction. "This isn't just about me," she said during her first public interview. "It's about making sure this never happens again." But not everyone welcomed her efforts. Some skeptics questioned her innocence, leaving cruel messages online and in her mailbox. Sarah read each comment, their sting fueling her resolve rather than breaking her. Lucas, always by her side, reassured her, "Your truth will outlast their ignorance." Slowly, allies began to emerge. Former inmates, wrongful conviction advocates, and even members of the legal community reached out, offering support. Sarah's story resonated with those who had suffered injustice, igniting a movement for reform. What began as a personal fight for survival was transforming into a collective call for accountability. Sarah's story spread like wildfire, sparking heated debates across social media, news outlets, and dinner tables. Her televised interviews revealed not just the flaws in her case, but the systemic issues that allowed such a tragedy to occur. "How many others have been silenced like me?" she asked during a primetime special, her voice calm but piercing. The public's response was overwhelming. Rallies demanding justice reform began popping up in major cities. With signs reading, "Justice for Sarah" and "Fix the System," people shared their own stories of injustice, creating a wave of solidarity. Sarah, once a symbol of tragedy, was becoming a beacon of hope. Political leaders and legal experts couldn't ignore the rising tide. Panels were formed to examine wrongful convictions, and petitions flooded lawmakers' offices. Sarah was invited to speak at a legal conference, where her powerful testimony left attendees both inspired and ashamed. "This system failed me," she said, locking eyes with the crowd. "It's time to make it right." Even those who had doubted her began to reconsider. A former prosecutor publicly apologized for their role in perpetuating a flawed system, stating, "Sarah's case is a wake-up call we can't afford to ignore." Her perseverance and dignity in the face of adversity were changing hearts and minds. As awareness grew, so did Sarah's determination. She founded a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting wrongfully convicted individuals, offering legal aid and emotional support. "We're not just fighting for justice," she told her growing team. "We're fighting for hope." The public, now fully awakened, stood ready to follow her lead. Sarah poured every ounce of her energy into reforming the justice system, transforming her pain into purpose. Her nonprofit, aptly named The Innocence Bridge, quickly gained traction, attracting skilled lawyers, activists, and volunteers who shared her vision. Together, they launched investigations into other wrongful convictions, unearthing stories that echoed Sarah's harrowing experience. One of their first victories came when they exonerated a man who had spent 15 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. At a press conference, Sarah stood beside him, her voice steady as she said, "Every win brings us closer to justice for all." Her words resonated far beyond the room, inspiring others to join the fight. Sarah worked tirelessly with lawmakers, proposing legislation aimed at preventing future miscarriages of justice. Lucas, now her closest ally, helped draft policies that demanded stricter evidence standards and increased accountability for prosecutors. "This isn't just reform," he said during a heated legislative debate. "It's a necessity." The reforms didn't come without resistance. Powerful figures in the legal system pushed back, dismissing Sarah's efforts as overreaching. But Sarah refused to back down, meeting criticism with grace and unshakable resolve. Her persistence paid off when a sweeping bill, informally dubbed Sarah's Law, passed in her state, implementing safeguards to protect the innocent. Sarah's movement grew, expanding nationally and even catching international attention. The Innocence Bridge became a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced, and Sarah, now a prominent advocate, continued to use her voice for change. Despite the challenges, she never wavered, knowing that every reform was a step toward a fairer future. After years of legal battles and advocacy work, Sarah found herself drawn back to the classroom, a place that once symbolized peace and purpose. Standing before a room of eager students, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since her arrest. But this time, she wasn't just a teacher. She was a mentor, an activist, and a survivor. Her lectures weren't confined to textbooks. Sarah shared stories of resilience, justice, and the importance of empathy, weaving her experiences into lessons that left her students inspired. "The world can be unjust," she told them, her voice steady. "But it's up to each of us to fight for what's right, no matter how daunting it seems." In addition to teaching, Sarah launched a mentorship program through the Innocence Bridge, aimed at guiding aspiring lawyers and advocates. She worked closely with Lucas to design workshops on ethical law practices and the dangers of bias in the justice system. "If we teach the next generation to do better, the system will have no choice but to change," she often said. Her classroom became a haven for discussions about morality, justice, and second chances. Students flocked to her, eager to learn not just about the law, but about life's deeper truths. Sarah's passion for teaching had evolved into a mission to empower young minds to think critically and act compassionately. Through her work, Sarah saw the ripple effects of her journey. Her students began leading initiatives within their communities, volunteering with legal aid groups, and advocating for marginalized voices. Watching them succeed, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing her story had sparked a movement far greater than she could have imagined. As Sarah stood in her classroom, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, she reflected on how far she had come. The horrors of her past had not been erased, but they had been transformed into a driving force for change. Her journey from a wrongly accused teacher to a voice for justice was proof that even in the darkest moments, light could emerge. Her life had become a testament to resilience, redemption, and the power of truth. With Lucas by her side, Sarah continued her mission, not just as an advocate for justice, but as a mentor to those determined to make the world a fairer place. "We can't change the past," she often said, "but we can fight for a future where no one has to endure what I did." Sarah's story inspired countless others to challenge a flawed system, proving that hope and determination could spark monumental change. And though her journey had been fraught with pain, it also revealed the strength she never knew she possessed. With her voice and actions, Sarah ensured that her suffering was not in vain. It became the foundation for a legacy of justice and compassion.